Okay.
Down at the bottom, there's that
Yeah, I've
record.
got it. I hit record, and so it should be being recorded.
And
Good. Sorry.
whoever's in control, can they mute everybody? And I want to remind you, if you, at the end when we have question and answer, if you talk, that's great. But when you get through, please put it back on mute. Thank you so much.
Scott can mute.
And
If you click on participants there, it'll give you, I think, an option to mute everybody.
it's not, there it is right there. Okay. Let's try that. Yeah, in a minute, I'll ask a question, I'll unmute and have a chance to share. And to do that, let me show you what I'm entitling this. And I'll share screen periodically and then pull it off so I can kind of see more of you during it. But we're talking about coping in the midst of crisis. And so we're thinking about these particular days and what's taking place at these particular times and talking about those kind of things. We, of course, in an hour or just a tiny bit over an hour, don't have enough time to cover things in a great deal of depth. And so we're really kind of skimming across the surface on a few things. And I'll tell you some things that I think, and some of the things that I'm seeing, but I also want you to tell me some of the things you think and some of the things you're seeing as we go through this too. And we'll have certain points for you to chip in with what you're seeing. But let's see, and here are the things we're going to try to cover. We're going to try to define crisis. We will talk about what makes this particular crisis so difficult. We'll talk about some basic steps to coping, and then we'll talk about crisis from God's perspective and circle back to that at the end. But let's see if we can do this. And if you will think with me for a second, think with me back to end of February, very first part of March, before everything was shut down, before we started receiving orders to shut down. And let me see if I can unmute. What was life like? What were things going on? What was your world like at that point? So end of February, 1st of March. Who remembers back that far?
Well, I had more projects that I wanted to get around to than I had time to get around to them.
Okay, list of projects, things you're going to get done, things you're going to accomplish. How many of you, show of hand, how many of you have projects you're going to try to get done? Some of you? Yeah, okay. Someone else, what was life like end of February, early March?
Constantly on the road.
On the road? Travel, plans for travel maybe? Plans for vacations?
Work.
Okay. Someone else.
We just took a trip to Oregon the first part of March. We had to come right back.
Okay. Did you have to cut your trip short and come back?
Yes, we flew, and then they started talking about shutting down airlines and all of that, so we had to come right back.
Our oldest daughter was in Israel. We held our breath she would be able to even get back and get back into the U.S. So anybody else? Late February, early March?
We were on a family vacation in Santa Fe and cut everything short and came back.
Okay. Again, heading back quicker than you planned to?
Yeah.
Yeah. Someone else?
We were going to work every day. We were going to church on the weekends and to lunch with our family, and going, shopping on the weekends, going to the mall, going wherever we wanted to go, whenever we wanted to go.
Kind of the routines of life, just the normal kind of things, doing those kind of things without really having to think necessarily, should we go to the mall or should we go this place or that place? Yeah. Let me just, and my part, was like that. I think in terms of what we were doing, we had an upcoming birthday that we were about to celebrate, and kind of started the questions of okay, should we have this birthday? And we did. We also had a wedding planned, a big family wedding planned for the end of March, and it got canceled. And so it was one of the front edge of things getting canceled. But early March, we were headed toward that big family wedding, things taking place. We had a daughter coming for spring break, and we're looking forward to that. Our daughter, who teaches in Houston, was headed this direction for spring break. Lots of plans. We were going to redo our front yard, and landscaping kinds of things. Get a lot done this spring. The other thing for us is we always do a March Madness bracket. Okay, the NCAA basketball championship. We're going to do our family brackets and compete against each other. So we were all positioning ourselves for that kind of thing. Life was different, and there was a pretty abrupt change, a pretty abrupt shift to what I think is a kind of crisis. And so let's see if we can, let me put the PowerPoint back up, and let's see if we can talk about crisis for a second, and just a couple of things about crisis. Defining crisis. There's a lady named Christy Cannell who, this is sort of her area of what she does. And let's see if this. Christy Cannell talks about a definition of crisis, and she has a 3-part definition that I think is pretty simple and pretty workable. Crisis is caused by some kind of precipitating event. There's something that goes on that initiates crisis. So caused by a precipitating event, the person's perception of the event causes distress. I think this part of her definition is important because perception is a big driver in crisis, and how you perceive it actually plays a big part in the impact. The person's perception causes distress. And then third, the person's coping mechanisms are challenged or overwhelmed. I think with crisis, there are times a person's coping mechanisms are just challenged, but a person steps up and meets the needs of the task and does fine, maybe even thrives. There are other times where a crisis is so strong that a person's coping mechanisms are actually overwhelmed. And so crisis can range from one end to the other. And so some kind of event causes distress for a person and generally challenges or overwhelms a person's coping mechanisms. Is her definition of crisis. But crisis can be quite varied. And let's talk about some elements of crisis and touch on this just fairly quickly. And let me tell you part of where I'm headed with this. After I talk about elements, I'm going to ask you to tell me what's the nature of this particular crisis we're in. And you give me your opinion on how it meets some of these criteria. So let's talk about some elements of crises. Crises can be real or perceived. And it's one of the really interesting things about crises. Crises can be something real, like you are fired from a job or you lose a job, or a crisis can be perceived. I'm afraid my company is in trouble. I'm afraid I could lose my job. The impact, interestingly, is the same, whether it's real or perceived. And the person can be in crisis, whether it's an actual event or a perceived event. But crises can be real or perceived. A second element, crises can have sudden onset or slow onset. Sudden onset or slow onset. A good example of a sudden onset crisis would be a tornado. Maybe you hear the tornado sirens, but it hits and all of a sudden there's chaos and damage, but it happens really quickly. But crisis can also have a slow onset. And an example of that would be a hurricane, where for a week ahead of time, we hear that something's coming, that something's going to happen at a certain point, there's going to be an impact. And over that week, the cone of uncertainty gets narrower and narrower, and we know exactly where it's going to hit and what time it's going to hit. And it still can do a great deal of damage, but it's a slow onset kind of crisis. Health concerns can be slow onset, where you have something taking place with your health, but the unfolding of that takes place over time. And so sudden onset versus slow onset. Brief or long duration. Some crises are very brief and some take place over a period of time. An example of a really brief crisis is if a parent of a 3-year-old is in a store, I think sort of before COVID, they're in a store and they look around and the child is missing. And for 38 seconds, they can't find the child, and they start looking and calling and they can't find them, and they're starting to panic. And then all of a sudden around the corner, they see the child. Okay. That crisis is resolved. It builds up really quickly, happens really quickly, may happen just a few seconds, but then it's over. Other crises can go on and on and on. Let's say the parent doesn't find that child and the worst happens. An example in military would be those that were missing in action or prisoner of war that were gone for a long period of time. And so it can be something that's a brief duration or a long duration. Fourth, crisis can be mild or severe. There are some crises that aren't very extensive, and there are some that aren't very impactful. There are others that are extremely severe and extremely impactful. Crises tend to be more severe when there is loss of resources, loss of health, or loss of life. And loss of lives, you can put kind of in parentheses, or threatened loss of lives. Okay? So when there are things that are lost, crisis tends to be more extensive. And then last, crises can be individual or cumulative. There can be one crisis that happens by itself, and it happens kind of without connection to other crises. And there are other crises that is like a bomb that sets off other bombs, or a domino that knocks over other dominoes. An example of this type of crisis would be Hurricane Harvey that happened 3 years ago on the Gulf Coast, where it just sat and caused damage over a long period of time. And so that was a cumulative kind of crisis where there are many, many individual crises sort of surrounding it. So some elements of crisis. Now, let me unmute again. And you tell me, how would you characterize this particular crisis that we're going through? What's the nature of this crisis we're experiencing right now with COVID-19? Real, okay. It's not just in our minds, is it? Although there are a few people on the internet that want to tell us it's all in our minds.
Are you on?
Okay. It's a very real thing that's taking place. What else?
Has become rather long-term.
Okay. We thought, didn't we? Well, let me speak for myself. I thought this might peak in April and be over by early May. Anybody kind of have that thought that this is sort of be over? Surely we're turning the corner. Surely we're past the worst of this right now. And what keeps happening? Yeah, as a runner, there are times I've run up hills and thinking I reached the peak of the hill, and I come over the hill and see there's another part, and go over that part and there's one more. And there are a few times I almost gave up because I thought I was at the top and I realized I wasn't. Okay? And I feel like this crisis kind of has some of that element to it. Someone else, how would you characterize this crisis?
Unpredictable.
Okay. Anybody heard an expert on TV that's gotten this exactly right? It's been pretty unpredictable, hadn't it? Yeah, like nothing we've seen. Any other characterizations of this crisis?
It's also cumulative, you know. We thought it's a small tip, and it's like building up and building up and building up. It's like, when is it going to stop?
And it's kind of a collection of crises, isn't it? It's a collection of 1,000 kind of little crises, big crises, medium crises, one giant one. And it does seem to be cumulative, that there are lots of things that are building up. Yeah. Anything else anybody would add?
I think not knowing when it's going to end is stressful. You know, I can handle a lot of problems and stresses as long as I know there's an end in sight. And this just dragging out and dragging out. So just the uncertainty of the end.
Okay, it doesn't have a known duration. And I think that's a big part of what makes it pretty stressful. Let me mute again, and then let me give you, I think this is a extensive, widespread, ongoing crisis with potentially deadly impact. It's one that a couple of things come to mind. I think it is like one giant domino, this virus itself, knocked over 1,000 other dominoes. Okay. And so there's the big crisis of the virus, but 1,000 other dominoes that get hit by this one big domino, or at least potentially could be knocked over by that domino. And I think where it goes from a health thing, a virus, the other dominoes are things like finances and logistics and relationships and all those kind of things that potentially could get knocked over by this one big domino falling over. And I think that's makes it difficult. I also think the ongoing nature makes it difficult. The fact that it is like you go over a rise and there's another hill, and you go over a rise and there's another hill, and we don't see the finish line. And as Larry said, I think if it had a known duration, like with the flu, we know we just have to make it through flu season, and when it gets warmer, we'll all be in better shape. And that's kind of how I think I was thinking about it. Then I think we can hang on, we can take care of ourselves for that period of time, and that makes it a little bit easier to deal with. And I think what happens when you have a crisis of this nature that's ongoing, to our central nervous system, it's our fight or flight nervous system that gets activated, but not like you're going to get attacked by a dog or hit by a truck. It sort of gets activated at a lower level, but it's activated. And I think it makes anxiety go up. And then as you have people in society whose anxiety goes up, it tends to have a little bit of a contagious effect that impacts other people around. And so you get sort of a societal anxiousness that goes up with that taking place. So it's a confusing time. It's a troubling time, and it's a specific kind of crisis. So let's see if we can, let me show you the next thing on the screen. Let's talk about why this period of time is so difficult, and that's kind of been implied in a few things, and you guys have said some things about that already, but let me unmute again. And I'll tell you my list in a second, but tell me why some of this seems so difficult. Why is this such a difficult time right now? Or what makes this time so difficult?
Uncertainty.
Uncertainty? It's a pretty big one, isn't it? Uncertainty? Yeah.
And nobody seems to know the answer.
Okay. Not real clear answers.
For some of us who like to control things, it's very hard to be totally out of control.
Okay, if you have a high need for control, this is probably even a tiny bit more challenging. And so if you like to kind of think things through and get all your ducks in a row and think through all the ramifications and those kind of things, this is not an easy time. It's like an enemy, but it's an unknown enemy. You don't even know where it is. Yeah. Why else? Why is it challenging?
Maybe too, it's affecting each one of us as individuals, but we also, a lot of us are in a position to guide others, like our students or our families. And it's a real challenge to be able to do that when it's also affecting, the individual.
Okay, it affects individuals And without clarity, it's hard if you're responsible for others to know how to necessarily help them or what to say to them or how to proceed taking care of yourself and taking care of them. Yeah. Someone else.
You can't be with your loved ones in certain circumstances. They're in the
Okay.
hospital or things like that.
Okay. Sometimes even just day to day. Definitely, if something were to take a twist or turn, a bad direction, I think that's a really challenging difficulty of this.
It's
Yeah.
affecting a lot of people's finances, which is very difficult.
Okay. Will I keep my job? Will I lose my job? Do I have a pay cut? One of our daughters, one of our twins who works at a hospital in Seattle. Seattle is one of the first areas hit. And she works for a hospital in the technology department, and her job is creating beds. And so she kind of controls the hospital beds and admission procedures. And so early on, she was working 70 and 80-hour weeks, okay? And without extra pay because it was just part of her salary. This week, she actually is on furlough from her hospital. And like so many other hospitals, they stopped doing elective surgeries and so are in financial struggles. And so those who worked so hard and actually were at great risk early on are now furloughed and are having time periods without pay. And so that's an interesting reward, isn't it, for even some of our frontline people and people who respond. That's pretty tricky, isn't it? Someone else, it's difficult. What's difficult?
Some relationships get frustrated because of differing perceptions of the severity of it.
Okay. They've become quite heated opinions about certain things, haven't they?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty strong opinions, and it can be with ones you love or people you care about. Yeah.
I think of young families with children at home all the time.
Okay, those that perhaps had to come home from work and educate children at home, or just keep children at home without outlet of being able to go out easily or go to normal places. Yeah. Yeah.
I think the fear of the disease itself and, knowing that there are people who can have it who are asymptomatic so they can share it with others without being aware of it. And then the severe ramifications that can happen. And, some people get it and don't get very sick, and some people get it and get very sick or die. And just that unknown aspect, you can try to protect yourself, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be successful.
Okay, and it's one of those, this may go back to what Tracy was saying. Common sense or good judgment doesn't necessarily help you in this. You could have lots of common sense and lots of good judgment and randomly have something happen. And that's tough. Our oldest daughter, who was a school teacher in Houston, was here for spring break. And she got notified while she was here, her school district was shut down. So she's been with us since that time. Her school district, which is Fort Bend, just outside of Houston, notified them at the end of the school year and told teachers, you have on Monday, after the semester ends, you have a 2-hour window to get in, get all your stuff out of your classroom, and to get your last minute paperwork signed to wrap up the semester and those kind of things. So she went back to Houston for about 3 or 4 days. She has 2 roommates down in Houston. She went back for 3 or 4 days, got all her things wrapped up, finished up the school year. She actually was teaching summer school, so she prepared to do that. Came back up here. A week after she got here, she got notified that both her roommates, who were asymptomatic while she was there, were diagnosed with both positive tests. And so she had to quarantine. We had to quarantine during that time. She's been here since then. And last week, she got notification that one of her roommates, and that was June, the first week in June, that when that happened, we're at mid-July right now, is one of her roommates is still testing positive. And so 6 weeks later, she is still testing positive. And so again, lots of unknowns of how this works and what's going on or why these things are happening. and you don't have the wisdom, the common sense that would help you navigate around this normally, doesn't necessarily help you navigate around it. Okay? Good list. Let me mute again, and then let me show you my list of some of why I think this is difficult and what makes this so difficult. So just a few things. I do think we went rapidly from life as usual to circumstances that really most of us have never experienced. Kind of thinking through the nature of this and what's taking place, there are certain things that have happened nationally that impact us all nationally. 9/11. There are regional things like hurricanes Katrina and Harvey. Going back even a little bit further, Persian Gulf War, Vietnam War. I go back to maybe World War II is the last time something was this impactful in certain kind of ways. I wasn't around, of course, but hearing stories from my parents going into World War II as the war was unfolding, and we knew we were going to be in the war, but there wasn't a clear sense of whether we would make it out or not. Okay, there's a lot of unknown. And then the rationing and the things that take place. I know stories from my parents of saving foil and having things like butter ration, things of that nature. I think this may be the closest to that, or I can't think of anything else. 9/11 was scary, but other than being able to travel, I don't think the impact was quite the same to so many people in so many places. So we rapidly went from life as usual, making plans to do normal kind of things, to many, many unknowns and uncertainties. I do think it's like we've been asked to be in a race. And we've been asked to be in a race, but no one has told us the rules, no one has told us the race course, or no one has told us where the finish line is, how short or long this race is. And that's really tough. And that's not life as usual. And there's so many unknowns, and I think that makes it particularly difficult. Okay. Number two, I think one of the challenges is the widely varying impact that this has had on different individuals. And you saw this especially during the early days. In the early days, there were some people who saw this as a great adventure. One of our children, who's a little bit more adventurous, immediately began buying plane tickets to travel to various places because she could get them for really low prices. And it wasn't until things got a little bit more serious that she kind of backed off on that and had to change some of those plans. But she saw this as a great adventure. And I'm gonna travel. I'm gonna pick up low cost airline tickets, and I'm gonna go anywhere I want to go. Well, all these older people are afraid of all this stuff going on. There are people when this first started who saw it a great adventure to learn French or to grow an indoor garden, or to catch up on remodeling their bathroom and more quality time with their children, and saw those kinds of things. And so you had people who saw it as a time of great adventure. You had people who saw it as a time of life reset. You had people who felt incredibly stressed and the stress of everything they had to deal with. I saw this especially in parents of school-age children. The stressors went through the roof immediately of having to educate your children at home, especially if both parents were working outside the home and had to balance work with that. My son and daughter-in-law, we have two grandchildren, 3 and 1, and they had to they both have technology jobs. They both were sent home to work, but they had to work with a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. And so there are times where they finally would get the kids in bed at 8, and one or both of them would have 4 hours of work still left to do before they could go to bed that night. That's incredibly stressful. So you had some folks that were incredibly stressed. you had other folks who have experienced very real loss in this, and the stress of losing a loved one, or perhaps even not from COVID, having a loved one die, but you couldn't have a funeral. And so you had those kind of stressors. So you had widely varying impact, from adventure to really, really difficult things taking place. And so I think that's been tough, the wide array of how different people have experienced this. And third, why is this time so difficult? I think there's been an informational moving target. And I think this has been a really tough thing that's taken place. You have had different information on how long the virus remains in the air. And how many of you have heard, well, it remains in the air or it can remain in the air for 6 feet? How many of you have heard that? Well, that's where our 6 feet social distancing comes from. How many of you have heard, well, maybe it remains in the air for 30 feet? Okay. How long it remains on surfaces? Well, on hard surfaces that are stainless steel, for instance, it'll go away in 2 hours or 3 hours or 4 hours, or maybe it stays 8 hours. That information seems to be a little bit of a moving target at times. Informational moving target on symptoms. How many of you have, several weeks into this, seen a list of additional symptoms that we didn't know were symptoms of it? Oh, by the way, here are some additional symptoms. Informational moving target, how to avoid it. Early on, one of the things I heard is you drink lots of water and you gargle hot water. Did anybody hear that one? I heard an expert reading a CDC thing, or referring to the CDC and giving guidelines like that. And the very next day, I heard that was a really bad list and don't do that. And that doesn't help at all. But I remember really clearly hearing a person with great certainty saying, here is how you avoid this. And now, information about, will there be a vaccine and how soon, and will this vaccine cause it to go away? Are there antibodies? Who has antibodies? How long do antibodies last? Informational moving target. I have become convinced that to get on TV, you don't have to be accurate, you just have to sound certain. Okay? You don't have to be accurate, you don't have to get it right, you don't even have to be truthful, you just have to sound like you know what you're talking about. And so I think we've had a lot of people giving us a lot of information, and a lot of it being informational moving target. I think that's part of what has made this difficult. Then my fourth one is, I do feel like the world has changed with this. I do think part of the reason it's been difficult is that routine tasks suddenly became challenging. Okay? A quick trip to H-E-B or Kroger's all of a sudden became potentially life-threatening, didn't it? Okay. Do you put on gloves? Do you wear a mask early on? Now, hopefully most people all people are wearing masks, but questions of that nature and things that we didn't think very much about. Are we going to have enough toilet paper? Okay. Early on, that was a big part of this. Will there be meat, or will the supply chain break down? Will we be able to get things that we want? Routine tasks became challenging. What was accessible was not easily accessible, is another part of this. Things that we had easy access to, all of a sudden we didn't necessarily have access to. We were put in the position of making decisions without being able to carefully calculate the consequences. Okay? Is this a really foolish thing I'm doing, or is the chance of anything happening really, 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 really low? And we just didn't know. We didn't have good information to make those decisions. And then one of the other things with the world changing is we lost marker dates and important celebrations. Okay? Let me exit out again. How many of you, unmuting it, let me ask, how many of you, either yourself or a loved one, have had a birthday during this time, or a wedding during this time, Houston's, or a funeral of a loved one during this time, okay, or a graduation? Okay, how many of you have attempted to have or have missed something of that nature? Okay, that makes it really, really hard, doesn't it? And I think that's part of why this has been so hard. Okay, my list. Anybody have anything you want to say that you would add to the list that I gave you? Why has this been so difficult?
Seems to me that people who are extroverts especially are struggling with this because they tend to get their energy from being around people.
I think the extrovert introvert question is a really interesting one, and we have that discussion at our house regularly because we have a mix of both. How many of you are extroverts? Okay. How many are introverts? Okay. Some of you may be a little bit more balanced between. Who's it harder on, extroverts or introverts?
You know, I think it makes sense that it's probably harder on extroverts, and I thought I would be fine living in my little introvert bubble, but it's not okay. It's hard. I want to see the people that I want to see. Not everybody, just, you know, the ones I want to see.
Her small little group.
Anybody else? Extrovert versus introvert? We have in our house people way down the spectrum on introversion and people way down the spectrum on extroversion. My wife says that it's harder on the introverts because the extroverts are at home driving the introverts crazy. So I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what she thinks. I watch my extremely extroverted daughter having a really hard time not going out and doing stuff and sitting on pins and needles. And things like having Zoom breakfasts with her friends and those kinds of things. So attempts to do that kind of thing. But I think it is kind of interesting, that question of if you're an introvert, how are you doing with all this? If you're an extrovert, how are you doing? I think maybe there are elements that are hard on both of those. Okay. Anybody else thoughts on why is this so difficult?
On the extrovert introvert issue, when I first I was in New Orleans when everything started shutting down, and I got back and I found it really hard because number one, New Orleans was a hot spot. I'm a bit of a hypochondriac, and so of course I was feeling like I was having symptoms, but I didn't have anybody to talk to about it except Charles, because I was sent to home to work and everything else. But what really helped was when we started doing things on Zoom. So and even at work, we started having daily meetings. And so that helped the extrovert be able to have contact with people and kept me a little bit more grounded than those first couple of weeks where it was just me by myself. That was very stressful.
Okay, and I bet for a lot of extroverts, that's a fairly common experience, that being cut off from that and knowing that you have to do it for safety's sake. But the interesting part is if you're squashed together in a small living space with an introvert and how all that happens. Okay, anybody else?
I think it's kind of hard not to have feelings of guilt that aren't really based in fact, but you know, like I want to see my elderly parents, that, you know, you're like, could I be exposing them to this? Or it's always, every outing kind of has you have to, instead of just doing it automatically, you have to kind of weigh whether it's the right thing to do or not the right thing to do.
And I do think that maybe in a nutshell is one of the hardest parts of this is things we normally did on autopilot. We have to make potentially life and death decisions without any information. And I think that's part of what makes it so difficult and so stressful in so many ways. And some people, I think, roll through life and just keep doing it. Other people are much more sensitive to that of kind of ruminating over what am I doing and what could this cause? And and what do I need to do? And I think it does make it, I think it does underscore some of the challenges. Okay, let's shift and talk to steps to coping. And let me leave you unmuted. And let's talk about that. And I'm going to give you my list in just a second. But let me ask for yours first. How, like, what are to go through this in a healthy way? What are some ways to go about doing it? What are some things you've done or you've seen others do? How do you navigate through this?
I try to keep my normal routines. Taking a shower every morning. I know all of my coworkers are not doing that. Shaving every day. Just try to make it as normal as possible.
Okay. Routines. I did wonder before my first Zoom meeting why I put on deodorant. But I did catch myself doing that before my first Zoom meeting. And still do. So routines, okay? Someone else.
Staying in contact with your loved ones via phone or whatever, Zoom. But I know I've been in contact with my brother and my sister a whole lot more than I ever used to be. So that's been helpful.
Okay, staying in contact with others. Someone else, what's helpful?
I've started walking.
Okay, exercise.
And I've never done it before. Of course,
Okay.
Cindy and Walter have been my mentors, my models. But my daughter would come over and say, let's walk. And then I just started doing it on my own. It's become part of my routine now.
Okay, very good. Early on, I went out jogging late in the evening, normally when there's no one out. And I have never passed that many people in my neighborhood because they were exercising. They're walking in groups of family and family members and more people than I've ever seen out in our neighborhood. So someone else, what's helpful? Okay,
For
let
me,
me
it's
go.
been helpful to find things to do around the house, have a project of some kind, and get some type of sense of accomplishment.
Okay, some kind of project, something that you can click off a list, something that you can make some progress on, that type of thing. Okay, and you guys hit several of the ones on my list, but let me walk through just some of the ones that I have. I do think staying connected is important to loved ones, to people maybe in your circle of concern, to people in your ministry sphere, people that you know that are in need. And this is one where I do feel like if you do tend to be introverted, this is a good place to do ministry and checking in to other people around you. If you're extroverted, excuse me. If you're introverted, make an effort still to reach out to folks and to stay in touch with folks. And I do think being intentional about relationships during this time is an important part of it, and an important part of coping. Keeping and creating routines, trying to keep routines as much as possible, or even creating new types of routines. The times I tend to be a person who gets up fairly well early in the morning, but I've found myself on days when I'm working from home, some mornings being a challenge to get up. And then I'm not as tired that night, and it can take on kind of a life of its own. And so I've had to make intentional efforts at times to get up around the time I normally do and to stay in that type of routine. But getting certain routines down, this is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to do this. And so creating routines. I do think things like celebrations are important. And I do think the fact that we've had these in some ways curtailed or altered is a big part of what's gone on here. I'm struck by how many celebrations that we see established by God in the Old Testament. They were always having a feast day or a festival day. And it seems like there were a lot of them, and it was important to have. And I think they serve important purposes. And I think one of the challenges of these is those days have been taken away in many ways, or they've been truncated or really sort of the biggest parts of them, the air taken out of them. And so being able to still try to do those kinds of things as much as we can. I do think coming up with ways to do birthday celebrations, our Houston daughter who is here, who is actually quite creative, came up with something for her birthday. All around, different family members went for a hike the afternoon of her birthday. And then we all met in an area in the Metroplex where she had ordered food from a delivery place, and we picked up separate deliveries, and we brought the food deliveries to our own houses, and then had a Zoom meeting for her birthday. Okay. And she had birthday parties. She had birthday party favors. She had toilet paper rolls wrapped up for each person who attended with a ribbon around it. At that time, it was still hard to get toilet paper. And so really creatively did her own birthday and did it to a coronavirus theme. So I'm not saying that you have to do something to a coronavirus theme, but I do think that one of the values of celebrations is having things to look forward to, having things that are a change of pace, having things that are something where you do kind of think back on perhaps the good things that have happened or what you've accomplished or where you come from. And so trying to keep having celebrations and making the most of those as much as you can. Making adjustments to life as it is changing. What has changed? What can I not control? What can I control? How do I need to go about getting the things that I need? My parents live a block away, and they're in their mid-80s. And so we changed things pretty rapidly with them not going out to one of our daughters that was here with us every week making a grocery store run for them. And so she would actually get their order, go to the grocery store, have stuff delivered to the car, take it to them, wipe the stuff down before she took it in the house. And that was the adjustment to get things to them and for something that she could do to help take care of them. So what kind of adjustments do I need to make to have this to change so that I can accomplish the things I need to accomplish? And then last of all, viewing crisis in relationship to God or God's perspective. And I'll say just a little bit more about that in just a second. But let me stop sharing again. And anything you would add to that? Coping, is there anything else you would say or you want to elaborate on any of those things? How do we cope? So let's finish up with talking about crisis from God's perspective and kind of bring it around to that. I do think viewing relationship in viewing crisis in relationship to God is important, or thinking about crisis in from God's perspective. And so let me say just a little bit about this. I wrote a fairly recent article in the Travis newsletter, and it had some of this in there, but I think it's important to think about crisis from God's perspective. So let me mention a few things. First of all, I think it's important to realize that a crisis for an individual or a crisis for a church or a crisis for the world isn't a crisis for God. And what's a crisis to us isn't a crisis to God, and I think that's important. I do remember early on in my adult life having car trouble and fretting over the car trouble, being anxious about the car trouble, and then realizing that God wasn't actually anxious about how I was going to get from point A to point B. Okay? God wasn't in heaven wringing his hands or pacing back and forth or anxiously trying to figure out how I was going to get transportation. And what seemed a crisis to me wasn't a crisis for God. I think in understanding or thinking about crises and the difference between us and God and seeing things from God's perspective is we do understand that where we're not in control, God is. And where we're anxious about our circumstances, God is not. But God does know our tendency to be anxious, and God does know our tendency to be afraid, and God does care, and God cares about us in the middle of crisis. So a crisis for an individual isn't a crisis for God, but in the midst of that crisis, God does know our circumstance, and God does care. Okay? Second, God comforts us in the midst of crisis and promises to be present. I am interested by the number of times in Scripture God tells some kind of person in Scripture to not be afraid. And often you see the term fear not, okay? And when you see that term, you often find it followed by the words, fear not, for I am with you. And the idea that there's encouragement to not be afraid, and there's encouragement to recognize that he's with us, okay? It's interesting to look through Scripture and note the individuals that God said, fear not to, or who admitted that they were afraid. And let me read you a list of, and this is a partial list, but these are folks in Scripture who God either told not to fear or who admitted that they were fearing and struggling with fear. Abraham, Jacob, Moses, Joshua, Gideon, Solomon, Jeremiah, Daniel, Zechariah, Joseph, the father of Jesus, Mary, the mother of Jesus, Peter, Paul, John, and many, many, many others. But that's a pretty big time list, isn't it? Okay, of folks that struggle with fear. When I find these passages where God says, "Do not be afraid," there's an interesting thing missing from those passages. You don't ever see anywhere in Scripture where God says, don't be afraid, and you need to confess your fear, your sin of fear. You don't see that, do you? Don't be afraid and confess. Okay? I think God knows how fragile we are, and he knows how prone we are to fear. And he knows how human we are in this. And he knows that a common state for us is fear or anxiousness. And so you don't see the lecturing parent telling us we're getting it wrong and we've got to get this right. What you see is an incredibly loving parent who understands how fragile we are and how weak we are, and who offers us words of comfort and offers to be present with us in the midst of our struggle, in the midst of crisis, and in fact promises to be with us at that time. So God in crisis comforts us and promises to be present. A third, crisis won't last forever. Okay? In the Bible, one of the really interesting phrases to me is, and it came to pass. And it came to pass. There are many, many, many crises in the Bible, and they ebb and flow. The crisis is there, maybe it builds, but then it subsides. And so crises don't last forever. And there will be a time that this changes. There will be a time that there will be routine again. There will be a time where things are more familiar. There will be a time where things feel more normal. Those things will happen, but we're not there now. And so we trust that God knows that we're in the midst of this and that he's present with us, but we also know that it won't last forever. And then last, I do think it's possible for there to be hope in the midst of crisis, that hope is resident in crisis, and it's possible to have hope in the midst of crisis. And I think the Apostle Paul understood this. And let me put a verse up here that I think shows that. Paul says, and this is Romans 5, 3 through 5. Paul says, he says, we also exult in our tribulations, knowing that tribulations bring about perseverance, perseverance, proven character, and proven character, hope. And this hope does not disappoint because the love of God has been poured out within our hearts through the Holy Spirit that was given to us. Okay? And so Paul talks about how even in tribulations, even in difficult times, it's possible to have hope. And it gives us this sort of progression that can happen, that difficulty can bring about perseverance. Perseverance can bring about proven character, and proven character can result in hope. Okay? Now, let me say just a couple of things about that. Are we guaranteed that this progression will happen? If there's tribulation, does this progression always happen?
Yeah.
How many of you have known a person go through difficult circumstances and they turn out mean and crotchety and not very nice and they're bitter and they never get over it? It happens, doesn't it? Yeah, I don't think this progression is guaranteed. I think this progression is possible. It's available, but it's not guaranteed because we know folks that don't go through difficult circumstances well, that they don't come out on the other side, that they don't come out in good shape. But it is possible. It's available. It's possible to have tribulations and have it produce in us perseverance, proven character, and proven character hope. I do think the hope is of a particular nature. And I think we tend to use the word hope interchangeably with what is more accurately wishing. Okay? Like if I say, I hope the Cowboys win the NFL championship, is that this kind of hope? No, that's a magical wish that hasn't come true for many years and probably won't for many more. Okay, that's wishing. That's not hoping. Okay, I wish that I could have a pony. That's a wish. I wish I would win the lottery. That's a wish. I wish the Cowboys would win the NFL championship. That's a wish. That's not hope. This is a hope that's based in the character of God. And it's based in the nature of who he is. And the nature of who he is that loving, perfect parent that knows our circumstances, that knows exactly the nature of the crisis we're in, that knows the end from the beginning, and cares about us in the middle of it. So that's where the hope is. And that's the part that orients us and actually serves as a kind of North Star that guide us as we go through time of crisis and guide us through this time with no finish line and more uphills than we thought were going to be there, and no rules, and the craziness of it. And that's where our hope is. It's in the character of God and in the person of God and who he is. Okay, thoughts or comments, anything you want to say about that? Okay, let me say this in conclusion. As I said at the start, at 1 hour, there's not a lot of time to go into a lot of depth. And so I don't necessarily pretend that I told you new material as much as hoping that what this does is kind of remind us that we're in this together. And that as a body of Christ, I think part of what we do is travel through this together. And when we can't be together with each other, being on Zoom and looking at each other on Zoom, and even sharing experiences like this the best we can electronically, praying for each other, encouraging each other, providing tangible help where that's possible to each other. I think that's part of how we go through this. And I think that's what we do. I do think we keep our eyes on Christ. We understand who God is in this, and we do our very best to trust that he guides us through and that he cares and that he knows. And I think that's how we go through this. So that's my encouragement, is even if there's nothing new in the things I've said, it's to be reminded or to be encouraged to hang in there as we go through these unusual days, and to do it in a way that hopefully helps us do it strong and helps us come out the other side with things like proving character and this hope that's even more firm at that point. So Larry or Jim, anything that you want to add at this point at the end here?
Larry?
No, again, thank you so much for the information. And yes, staying connected and meeting in Zoom, every opportunity is a great encouragement. And thanks again, Scott.
Okay, well, thank
Scott,
you.
I really appreciate your last comment about hope. You know, that passage says hope that does not disappoint,
Yeah.
which suggests that there might be hope that does disappoint. And, you know, I think the same thing with faith. It's one thing to say we have faith, but sometimes it's the faith that we generate. It's a kind of willful faith. I'm going to make myself do this. I'm going to make myself hope. And your point about that hope deriving from the character of God is parallel to faith that is also of Christ. And I think that's supremely important. You know, it's, there are wishes and there's hope. There's, I believe mentally, and there's trust. They're differentiated. And in times like this, I think it's important for us to remember what you said. That hope is not based on, the old hymn, my hope is based on nothing less than Jesus Christ in his blood and his righteousness. So it's not something that we generate in ourselves. And none of us has a hope or a faith that's strong enough to sustain us in these times. So I really appreciate your pointing us to the fact that it all begins in God, and we've got to draw our strength from him.
And I think wishes tend to have desired outcomes. I wish I would win the lottery. I wish Dallas would win the NFL championship. I think wishes have desired outcomes. I think hope is in God's character, trusting that he knows the outcome and he'll be with us no matter what the outcome is. And I think that's the difference. Okay, well, let me lead us in prayer. And again, thank you guys for participating and for chipping in. And let me pray for us as we close. Dear God, I thank you for your graciousness and for your care and help. I thank you that you are the God of the universe, and you know these circumstances, and none of these caught you off guard or surprised you. You know the end from the beginning. You know where we are in the midst of this, and you know each of our circumstances and the hard things and the challenging things and the confusing things and even the good things. And I'm thankful that you're a personal God. And God, I pray that you give us the strength to keep our faith in you in the midst of this, and that you would be with us as we go through it. And I pray in that we could reflect you to others around us. I thank you again for your incredible love. And I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Scott, very much.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Scott.
Okay.